Greetings, dear viewers. This is George from Ireland, and I'm carrying on my series about Nazi Germany for A-level history. So I'm now looking at the Volksgemeinschaft, as in the racial community. So Volk is the German word for people, but in the sense of nation, not persons. The Nazis sought to build a Volksgemeinschaft, a racial community. Now, this was to exclude certain sections of German society, such as the Jewish community, gypsies, for instance, those whom the Nazis deemed to be asocials, which would be homeless people, alcoholics, people who were just unusual, socially marginal people were going to be persecuted. Jehovah's Witnesses, Quakers, the Freemasons, the Nazis outlawed the Freemasons. They had a distrust of the society with secrets. It's something that they couldn't control because the Nazis believed in totalitarianism. The government had to get its tentacles into all areas of life and control every facet of people's existence. So the Nazis claimed that Germans were Aryans, a special racial group who were exceptionally gifted and all that, and they felt that was also true of certain other Northern European nationalities, say the Swedes or the Dutch, the British and so on. It's largely nonsense, of course. Anyway, they believed in all sorts of bonkers theories about how they weren't related to the Poles. Now, there's an indigenous Slavic ethnic group in Germany, the Sorbs, S-O-R-B, that's how you spell Sorb, and perhaps surprisingly, they weren't persecuted by the Nazis. There are only about 20,000 of them. So, what else about the racial community? Making people believe that they were unusually fit and intelligent and so on, and good at warfare, and that they could enslave other ethnic groups, particularly in Eastern Europe. Those people were not fully human, they were subhuman and so on. They were also racist against all non-white peoples except the Japanese. So they disseminated these rebarbative racist theories. And they wanted everyone to feel united, those who were part of the Volksgemeinschaft, that class distinctions no longer mattered. And the Nazis had a fair degree of success in breaking down class barriers, that religious denomination no longer mattered. Remember, about 2/3 of Germans were Protestants, and most of the remainder were Roman Catholics. So the Nazis were distinctly cheery about the Catholic Church. Its headquarters is in Rome. And remember, from the 1520s until 1978, every single pope who was elected was an Italian. So again, it was something they couldn't control. They felt that Catholics might have divided loyalties. Remember, Hitler himself was brought up as a Catholic, so was Goebbels, a few of the others, Himmler, but most of them were Protestants in their upbringing. So they weren't people who heard mass, these Nazis who were nominal Catholics. But they did kiss and make up with the Catholic Church in the beginning. Only a few months after the Nazis came to office, they signed a concordat with the Catholic Church. It's a treaty with the Catholic Church. You might say it was their cardinal error. And indeed, the man who'd be the papal nuncio, that's ambassador to Bavaria, was Eugenio Pacelli. And in 1938, he was elected Pope Pius XII. So this concordat, this treaty between Germany and the Roman Catholic Church, said that the Roman Catholic Church would be allowed to run its schools, universities, hospitals, orphanages, a few charitable institutions of that nature. Its property was guaranteed. The state would not confiscate it. And in return, the Catholic Church must stay out of politics, must avoid criticising the Nazi movement in any way. So there were Catholic youth clubs still going on. However, the Gestapo started to give them a hard time. They were harassed, they were intimidated, and Catholic children were getting into trouble at school for not being members of the Hitler Youth. Now, of course, there were some Catholics who were in the Hitler Youth right from the beginning, but the Catholic youth organizations dwindled and were eventually banned, and by 1939, everybody was in the Hitler Youth, or its female equivalent, the League of German Girls. So the Catholic Church had been conned, and that's why in 1937, Pope Pius XI published a tract, Mit brennender Sorge, with burning anxiety, about how he was worried about the way things were going in Nazi Germany. The Catholic Church was particularly worried about the situation in Germany because it remembered Kulturkampf for the 1870s, was a German governmental campaign against the Catholic Church, which consisted of some confiscating of property, banning a few publications, insisting priests had to have an ordinary degree before they went on to a seminary, things like that. It actually didn't amount to that much. Nobody was killed in Kulturkampf in the 1870s, this campaign against the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had not been outlawed in the 1870s. So it was a bit of a non-event. It didn't go as far as it might have done. But anyway, the Catholic Church had been compromised. Its party had been dissolved. With the Centre Party was a party for Catholics, with the agreement of its leader, Monsignor Kass. Monsignor, as in he's a priest, a particular high-ranking priest, was called a Monsignor, not just Father Kass. So then the Lutheran Church was a bit more enthusiastic about Nazism, because the Lutheran Church is distinctly German, founded in Germany and so on, and they say they stand for German patriotism and family values and all the rest of it. There was a bit of anti-Semitism there. And the Lutheran pastors tended to hobnob with the upper classes. They were concerned about the thuggishness of Nazism and the way it was not very biblical. It didn't encourage education and so on. But anyway, they got into bed with the Nazi movement. There were some people who formed the Confessing Church, Protestants who broke away from the Lutheran Church and who remained dissidents. Bonhoeffer and Niemöller were two of the most famous Protestant pastors who spoke out against Nazism, and indeed one of them paid with his life for his dissent. The other one survived the war. So the Nazi Party didn't want people to think of themselves as being Catholic or Protestant. That no longer mattered, and they wanted them to think of themselves as primarily German, nothing to divide the German community. And they set up their own Reich Church, which, as well as the Bible, promoted the swastika as symbol and didn't like any of this namby-pamby stuff about compassion in Christianity. The Nazis were looking to abolish Christianity if they won the war and come up with the German faith movement. They were embarrassed about Christianity's roots in Judaism and so on, the way it was international and might sometimes promote mercy. The Nazis also remember the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48, when about a third of the German population had been slaughtered, Germans fighting Germans for over abstruse points of Christian doctrine. Anyway, so they didn't want any alternative focus for loyalty, that's churches. And the most ardent Nazis wouldn't list themselves as being Christians or Catholics or Protestants. They would say believer in Gott, Gottbeglaubiger. So they thought they could bring in neo-paganism, try and resurrect some pagan faith they could find from before Christianity had come in the Dark Ages. So there were very few written records, thought about writing in runes and things like that. So the churches, well, there were dissidents within the Catholic Church who also spoke out against Nazism, particularly towards the end, and quite a few Catholic priests and indeed Protestant pastors were sent to concentration camps, and some of them paid with their lives for their courageous dissent. Maximilian Kolbe would be one, a Catholic priest who heard that a Polish army officer was going to be put in a room and starved to death to punish him for the escape of other prisoners, and Kolbe said, "No, this guy's married with children, take me instead." So he was put in a room and not fed anything for weeks and indeed starved to death. He's later become a saint. One of the other uplifting things about this, he was here as a German person willing to lay down his life to save a Polish person. That's another thing I'd like to emphasize about these talks. They are in no wise anti-German. I deplore racial and religious prejudice of all kinds, and so nobody should be mistreated on the grounds of his faith or ethnicity, and that includes Germans. So mentioning all these ghastly things that were done under the Third Reich, and I don't wish to promote hostility against German people. Let me see. So confessional differences had broken down to a small extent, and church attendance had dipped a bit. People were busy with the Nazi activities. The war came and it rose a bit because people were worried about being killed. So the Catholic and Protestant clergy, they cooperated quite well in opposing Nazism, those who were dissidents. And that was a sea change because Catholic and Protestant clergymen usually didn't meet each other. They found it faintly embarrassing. I mean, nowadays in Europe, there's almost no distinction between Catholics and